that whole sequence, I can't remember how many locations we used, but it was probably 10 to get him to the Mangrove restaurant. It was stitching together several different components, and part of that was not that we wanted to make a literal journey from A to B, but because each moment of that journey has to tell part of the story.
I think there's something about something set in London, especially when you're from London and West London. I live in West London, so you're always looking for those signifiers. They're like, I recognize that spot, and even if maybe sometimes you can't because the location can't be, you can't get it for whatever reason. How was that an issue that you wanted people to really recognize it, or did you just want to create this essence of the time and the space? And was it difficult at all in any way?
Yeah, it was difficult. It was complicated because I really had a sort of a notion, I suppose, that we would be able to set each story in a different part of London, and so in order to give it its own flavour and its own architecture. But there was no, it quickly became apparent that was never going to happen, because you just can't find you can't find everything you're looking for in one area anyway. But then, like with Notting Hill, we decided to remove it slightly from Notting Hill. We wanted to kind of shoot it around Kilburn, so it has sort of had a feel of Notting Hill. But then we needed to find All Saints Road, and that was difficult. And we also had to shoot parts of it in all over London, really. I mean, every location was compromised in one way or another. It sort of came to a dead end. The location would come to a dead end, and you couldn't move any further, so you'd have to stitch it together with another location somewhere else in another part of London. And that was very frustrating, really. We couldn't kind of get.
Could I ask what the compromises were and why something would come to a dead end when it comes to location? And this is me coming very I don't know what the hell.
Well, for example, in the opening sequence to the Mangrove story, where we had Frank Critchlow in gambling in a gambling den, and then he comes up some steps and he goes, we really wanted the Westway to feel like a kind of community divide, for it to be symbolic of London being redeveloped, after the war, and how that was splitting the community. The Westway was, not helping anybody who lived in that area, help the people trying to go jump it, but not the people living there. So, but that whole sequence, I can't remember how many locations we used, but it was probably 10 to get him to the Mangrove restaurant. It was stitching together several different components, and part of that was not that we wanted to make a literal journey from A to B, but because each moment of that journey has to tell part of the story. But it would have been fantastic to find it all in a more natural, organic way. But we couldn't do that. We were, I can't remember where it was exactly, but way outside the M25 to the north. Wow. Deptford, Kilburn, I can't remember, but there were a lot of locations, and so that's complicated. It's time consuming. There's lots of travel. There's lots of kind of frustration because you just want it to be a bit more seamless. So that's the kind of difficulty we were up against, is because you just cannot find those sort of locations in their original condition anymore.
Yeah.
You have a kind of, aspiration that you will, but it just never seems to happen that way.
Well done for those 10 locations.
I may have exaggerated, but I don't think I have.
But I mean, then I suppose, Chris, are Helen's problems your problems when it comes to stitching it all together and editing it? How does that
reflect? No, it wasn't, because you did a good job of it. So I mean, those locations around, I know them, All Saints Road. I go down there every day, I go down there, and then somebody the other day said, "Hang on, that's not Notting Hill. That's around the corner from us, isn't it?" And I said, "Oh yeah, okay, but it doesn't matter." And the whole point is actually it worked, and there was never any problem with that. Never. I mean, you know, it's getting that to work, particularly in the mangrove. Actually, although I knew it. But it was, and part of that was the way it was shot, because it was, you know, actually there was only really one or two big wide shots at the beginning of like the West Way, which we created as a visual effects thing, and then we went under it, and then after that we were like right in there, pretty much for the entire film. You know, there weren't really like big wide establishing shots. We were there within the crowd or in the riot or within those kind of places in the courtroom. There wasn't really a wide establisher of the courtroom, not a traditional one. We tried it a bit. We tried to find a library shot and things. We could like stitch that together with something else, and it just didn't work with the language of the film, because again, this was another view of this society that we're seeing from the inside. So you know, the locations became, not that they didn't matter, but it was, you weren't looking at that, you were looking at the people in amongst it.
I'd love to know about all of your relationships with Steve in his role as writer, director and creator, and in parallel with your roles on the project. Chris, Steve was in the editing room as well, so what was that like, and how did you balance that act? And in general, what's your relationship between Steve and his role and yours as editor?
Well, I mean, you know, like, I mean, it's difficult to say, like, classic director-editor relationship most of the time. I mean, it's, how did it work? I mean, it was, whilst we were filming, I mean, Steve came in every day he could, and we worked on, he likes to just get straight in there and get to the finished sequence that works. And a lot of those sequences didn't change that much right from the beginning. But he kind of wants you to think of your own idea. He wants you to lead. He sort of wanted me to lead with it and present something to him, rather than him having to say, "Oh, this is what I wanted to do, and this was my vision of it," and all that. He didn't really talk about that. He wanted to, like me, just cut it. And I started the series late, so I started editing Mangrove whilst they were filming Lovers Rock. So I was doing both at the same time. And so I sort of did as much as I could of Mangrove, and then I felt it was getting a bit heavy, the story. So I just went and jumped to Lovers Rock as it was filming, and so I sort of had an antidote to that. And then of course, every time Steve came in, he wanted to see Lovers Rock. He didn't want to see Mangrove, but you know, because Lovers Rock was his kind of like, what's the word? I think he saw it as the sort of jewel of the series in a way, right from earlier, kind of slightly experimental. But in terms of our relationship, I mean, you know, it was more, it was for a very long time, and then at a certain point we were in different countries because of the whole lockdown and stuff. So I was working in London, he was in Holland. We had to come back from Holland. So I mean, how can I describe it? It's Steve's he's not like any other director I've worked with. He's really unique. And the main thing that he sort of had to educate me as to what his kind of language, you know, the way he works. And I found I cut things a little tight, little short, particularly Lovers Rock. And there's a couple of sequences in there that you know, I just thought, okay, Silly Games is 3.5 minutes long song. They did a bit of improv, so I made it a little longer, and I thought that felt about right. And Steve came to watch it. He says, not long enough. So the process was about making it longer. I said, well, how much longer? I said, I'll have another go, I said, and I'll make it longer. So I sort of doubled it in length. And Steve said, no, it still doesn't feel right. I want to put more in. I said, well, how much? He said, well, everything. Basically, we used almost everything that they shot. And in that particular sequence, there were 3 takes, maybe 4. that they just ran the camera. And this is like going back to what Jacqueline said about he got great performances out of the, you know, the supporting artists, but also it looked beautiful. I mean, in every way, the costumes, the design, the photography, what you name it, it looked beautiful. So that allowed us to hold shots. And this is what, particularly with that film, I mean, they all have a different way, had a different approach in terms of the editing, and we could talk for probably days about that. But like Lovers Rock is quite specific in that, in holding, and that wasn't the only sequence, like the Kunta Kinte dub sequence at the end, which is like they did 3 times, and we used it every one. They went back and replayed the song, which is just most people would never do that except Steve.